The Christian in Complete Armor by William Gurnall. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 14c. Chapter 7. A second incident wherein the power of holiness is to appear in the Christian's life, as an example in the duties of God's worship. Secondly, the Christian must exert the power of holiness in the duties of God's worship. The same light that shows us at God convinces he is to be worshipped, and not only so, but that he will be worshipped in a holy manner also. God is very choice in all that belong to his worship under the law. If he hath a tabernacle, a place of worship, it must be made of the choicest materials. The workmen employed to make it must be rarely gifted for the purpose. The sacrifices to be offered up, the best in every kind, the males of the flock, the best of the beasts, the fat of the inwards, not the avails. The person that attends unto the Lord, the minister unto him, they must be particularly holy. What is the gospel of all this? But that God is very curious in his worship. If in any action of our lives we be more holy than others, surely it is to be when we have to do with God immediately. Now, this holiness and duties of worship should appear in these particulars. First, in making conscience of one duty as well as another, the Christian must encompass all within his religious walk. It is dangerous to perform one duty that we may dispense with ourselves in the neglect of another. Partiality is hateful to God, especially in the duties of religion, which have all a divine stamp upon them. There is no ordinancy of God's appointment which he hath not blessed to his people, and we must not reject what God owns. Yea, God communicates himself with a great variety to his saints, now in this, anon in that, on purpose to keep up the esteem of all in our hearts. The spouse seeks her beloved in secret duties at home and finds him not. Then she goes to the public and meets him, whom her soul loves. Canticles 3:4. Daniel, no doubt, had often visited the throne of grace and been a long trader in that duty, but God reserved the fuller manifestation of his love in opening some secrets to him until he did, to ordinary prayer, join extraordinary fasting and prayer. Then the commandment came forth, and a messenger from heaven dispatched to acquaint him with God's mind and heart, Daniel 10:3, compared with the verse 23. There is no duty, but the saints find at one time or another the Spirit of God breathing sweetly in and filling their souls from it with more than ordinary refreshing. Sometimes the child sucks its milk from this breast, sometimes from that. David, in meditation, while he was musing, finds a heavenly heat kindling in his bosom till at last the fire breaks out. Psalms 34, verse 3. To the eunuch in reading of the word is sent Philip to join in his chariot, Acts 7, verses 27 and 28. To the apostles, Christ makes known himself in breaking of the bread, Luke 24, verse 35. The disciples walking to Emmaus and conferring together presently have Christ fall in with them, who helps them to untie those knots which they were posed with, Luke chapter 24, verse 15. Cornelius, at duty in his house, had a vision from heaven to direct him in the way he should walk, Acts 10:3. Take heed, Christian, therefore, thou neglectest not any one duty. How knowest thou? But that is the door at which Christ stands waiting to enter into thy soul. The Spirit is free. Do not bind him to this or that duty, but wait on him in all. It is not wise to let any water run beside thy mill, which may be useful to set thy soul a-going heavenward. Maybe, Christian, thou findest little in those duties thou performest. They are empty breasts to thy soul. It is worth thy inquiry, whether there be not some other thou neglectest. Thou hearest the word with little profit may be. I pray tell me, dost thou not neglect sacraments? I am sure too many do, and that upon weak grounds, God knows. And wilt thou have God meet thee in one ordinance, who dost not meet him in another? Or if thou frequentest all public ordinances, is not God a great stranger to thee at home, in thy house and closet? What communion dost thou hold with him in private duties? Here is a hole wide enough to lose all thou gettest in public, if not timely mended. Samuel would not sit down to feast with Jesse and his sons till David, though the youngest son, was fetched, who was the only son that was wanting. 2 Samuel 16, verse 11. If thou wouldest have God's company in any ordinance, thou must wait on him in all. He will not have any willingly neglected. O fetch back that duty which thou hast sent away, though least in thy eye, yet it may be. It is that God means to crown with his choicest blessings in thy soul. Secondly, in a close and vigorous pursuance of those ends for which God hath appointed them. Now, there is a double end which God chiefly aims at in the duties of his worship. First, God intends that by them we should do our homage to him as our sovereign Lord. Secondly, he intends them to be as means through which he may let out himself into the bosom of his children and communicate with the choices of his blessings to them. Now here the power of holiness puts forth itself when the Christians attend narrowly to reach these ends in every duty he performs. First, God appoints them for this end, that we may do our homage to him as our sovereign Lord. Were there not a worship paid to God, how should we declare and make appear that we hold our life and being of him? One of the first things that God taught Adam, and Adam his children, was divine worship. Now, if we will do this wholly, we must make it our chief care to perform every duty, that by it we may sanctify his name in it and give him the glory due unto it. A subject may offer a present after such a ridiculous fashion to his prince, that he may count himself rather scorned than honored by him. The soldiers bowed the knee to Christ, but they mocked him. Matthew 27, verse 29. And so does God reckon many do it by him, even while they worship him. By the carriage and behavior of ourselves in religious duties, we speak what our thoughts are of God himself. He that performs them with the holy awe upon his spirit and comes to them filled with faith and fear, with joy and trembling, he declares plainly that he believes God to be a great God and a good God, a glorious majesty and a gracious. But he that is slightly and slovenly in them tells God himself to his face, that he hath mean and low thoughts of him. The misbehavior of a person in religious duties arises from his misapprehensions of God, whom he worships. What is graven on the seal, you shall surely see printed on the wax, and what thoughts the heart hath of God are stamped on the duties the man performs. Abel showed himself to be a holy man, and Cain appeared a wicked wretch in their sacrifice. And how? But in this, that Abel aimed at that end which God intends in his worship, the sanctifying his name, which Cain minded not at all, as may appear by comparing Abel's sacrifice with his in two particulars. First, Abel is very choice in the matter of his sacrifice, not any of the flock that comes first to hand, but the firstlings. Neither did he offer the lean of them to God and save the fat for himself, but gives God the best of the best. But of Cain's offering, no such care is recorded to be taken by him. It is only said that he brought of the fruit of the ground and offered unto the Lord, Genesis 4, verse 3 and 4. But not a word that it was the first fruit or best fruit. Again, Abel did not put God off with a beast or two for a sacrifice, but with them gives his heart also. By faith, Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. Hebrews 11, verse 4. He gave God the inward worship of his soul, and this was it that God took so kindly at his hands, for which he obtained a testimony from God himself that he was righteous. Whereas Cain thought it enough, if not too much, to give him a little of the fruit of the ground, had the wretch but considered who God was, and what his end in requiring an offering at his hands, he could not have thought rationally that a handful or two of corn was that which he prized or looked at any further than to be a sign of that inward and spiritual worship which he expected to come along with the outward ceremony. But he showed what base and unworthy thoughts he had of God, and accordingly he dealt with him. O Christians, remember when you engage in any duty of religion that you go to your homage to God, who will be worshipped like himself. Cursed be the deceiver, which hath in his flock a male and sacrifices unto the Lord a corrupt thing. For I am a great king, saith the Lord of hosts, and my name is dreadful among the heathens. This made David so curious about the temple which he had in his heart to build, because the palace was not for man, but the Lord God. 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 1. Therefore, verse 2, he said, he prepared with all his might for the house of his God. Thus shouldest the gracious soul say, when going to any duty of religion, it is not man, but the Lord God I am going to minister unto, and therefore I must be serious and solemn, holy and humble, etc. Secondly, the second end God hath appointed divine ordinances and religious duties for is to be a means whereby he may let out himself to his people and communicate the choices of his blessings into the bosoms There saith the psalmist, speaking of the mountains of Zion, where the temple stood, the place of God's worship, commanded he the blessing, even life forevermore. Psalms 133, verse 3. That is, he hath appointed the blessing of the life spiritual, grace, and comfort, which at last shall swell into life eternal, to issue in stream thence. The saints ever drew their water out of these wells. Their souls shall live that seek the Lord. Psalms 69, verse 32. And their souls must need die that seek not God here. The husbandman may as well expect a crop where he never plowed and sowed, and the tradesman to grow rich, who never opens his shop doors to let customers in, as he to thrive in grace or comfort that converses not with the duties of religion. The great things God doth for his people are got in communion with him. Now here appears the power of holiness, when a soul makes them his business, which he follows close and attends to in duties of religion, to receive some spiritual advantage from God by them. As a scholar, knowing he is sent to the university to get learning, gives up himself to pursue this and neglects other things. It is not riches or pleasure he looks after, but learning. Thus the gracious soul bestirs him, and flies from one duty to another, hence the bee from flower to flower to store itself with more and more grace. It is not credit and reputation to be thought a great saint, but to be indeed such that he takes all this pains for. The Christian is compared to a merchantman that trades for rich pearls. He is to go to ordinances as the merchant that sails from port to port, not to see places, but to take in his landing, some here, some there. A Christian should be as much ashamed to return empty from his traffic with ordinances as the merchant to come home without his landing. But alas, how little is this looked after by many that pass for great professors, who are like some idle persons that come to the market, not to buy provisions and carry home what they want, but to gaze and look upon what is there to be sold to no purpose. O my brethren, take heed of this. Idleness is bad anywhere, but worse in the marketplace, whereas so many are at work before thy eyes, whose care in their souls both adds to thy sin and will, another day, to thy shame. Dost thou not see others grow rich in grace and comfort by their trading with those ordinances from which thou comest away poor and beggarly? And canst thou see it without blushing? If thou hadst but a heart to propound the same end to thy soul when thou comest, thou mightest speed as well as they. God allows a free trade to all that do value Christ and his grace according to their preciousness. O everyone that athirst, and come ye to the waters, and he that hath no money, come ye buy and eat. Yea, come buy wine and milk without money and without price. Isaiah 55, verse 1. The Spirit of God seems in the judgment of some to allude to a custom in marine towns, when a ship comes with commodities to be sold, they used to carry them upon the town. Ho, all that would have such and such commodities, let them come to the waterside, where they are to be had at such a price. Thus Christ calls everyone that sees his need of Christ and his graces to the ordinances, where these are to be freely had of all that come to them for this very end. End of chapter 7, having been read by Peter John Paresis. The Christian in Complete Armor by William Gurnall. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 14c. Chapter 8, a third instance, wherein the power of holiness must appear, and that is in the Christian's worldly employments. Thirdly, the Christian must express the power of holiness in his particular calling and worldly employments, that therein he is conversant with. Holiness must be written upon those as well as on his religious duties. He that observes the law of building is as exact in making a kitchen as in making a parlor. So by the law of Christianity, we must be as exact in our worldly business as in duties of worship. Be holy in all manner of conversation. 1 Peter 1:15. We must not leave our religion, as some do their Bibles, at church, as in man the highest faculty, which is reason, guides man's lowest actions, even those which are common to beasts, such as eating, drinking, and sleeping. Man doth, that is, should, if he will deserve his own name, exercise these graces as reason directs. He should show himself in them a rational creature. So grace, that is the highest principle in a Christian, is to steer and guide him in those actions that are common to man as man. The Christian is not to buy and sell as a mere man, but as a Christian man. Religion is not like that statesman's gown, which, when he went to recreate himself, he would throw away and say, "There, lie, Lord Treasurer, a while." No, wherever the Christian is, whatever he is doing, he must keep his religion on, do it wholly. He must not do that in which he cannot show himself a Christian. Now the power of holiness puts forth itself in our particular callings these ways, but take them conjunctively. The beauty of holiness appears in the symmetry of all the parts together. First, when the Christian is diligent in his particular calling, when God calls us to be Christians, he calls us indeed out of the world as to our affections, but not out of the world as to employment. It is true, when Elisha was called, he left his plow and the apostles their nets, but not as they were called to be saints, but because they were called to the office in the church. Though some in our days could find in their hearts to send the officers of the church to the plow again. But upon how little reason let themselves judge, who find one trade, if it be well followed, and manage with a full stock, enough to find them work all the week, and sure the minister that hath to do with, yea, provide for more souls than thy bodies, may find his head and heart as full of work in his calling from one end of the year to the other as any of them all. But I am speaking to the private Christian. Thou canst not be holy if thou art not diligent in a particular calling. The law of man counts him a vagrant that hath not a particular abiding place, and the word of God counts him a disorderly person that hath not a particular calling, wherein to move and act for God's glory and the good of others. We hear there are some which walk disorderly among you, working not at all. 2 Thessalonians 3:11. God would have his people profitable like the sheep, which does the very ground good it feeds on. Everyone should be the better for a Christian. When Onesimus was converted, he became profitable to Paul and Philemon. Also, Philemon verse 11. To Paul as a Christian, to Philemon as a servant. Grace made him of a runaway a diligent servant. An idle professor is a scandalous professor. An idle man does none good, and himself most hurt. Secondly, when he is not only diligent, but for conscience sake. There are many are free enough of their pains in their particular callings. They need no spur. But what sets them on work? It is conscience, because God commands it? Oh no. Then they would be diligent in their general calling also. They would pray as hard as they work. They then would knock off, as well as fall on, at God's command. If conscience were the key that opened their shop on the weekday, it would shut it on the Lord's day. When we see a man, like the hawk, fly after the world's prey, and will not come to God's lure, though conscience bids in his name come off, and wait on thy God in this duty in thy family, that in thy closet, but still goes on his worldly chase. He shows plain enough whose errand he goes on, not of conscience, but of lust. But if thou wilt walk in the power of holiness, thou must be diligent in thy calling on a religious account. That which makes thee fervent in prayer must make thee not slothful in business. Thou mayest say that in the place God hath set me in, I am but his servant in my own shop, and here I must serve him as I would have an apprentice or child serve me. Yea, much more, for they are not mine so much as I am his. Thirdly, when he expects the success of his labor from God, and accordingly if he speeds, gives his humble thanks to God. Indeed, they go together. He that doth not the one will not the other. The worldling that goes not through his closet by prayer into his shop in the morning, when he enters upon his business, no wonder if he returns not at night by his closet in thankfulness to God. He began without God. It were strange if he should end in him. The spider that spins her web out of her own bowels dwells in it when she hath done. And men that carry on their enterprise by their own wit and care entitle themselves to what they think they have done. They will sooner sacrifice as they to their net and drag, Job chapter 8, Habakkuk 1:16, to their own wisdom and industry than to God. Such a wretch I have lately heard of in our days, who, being by a neighbor excited to thank God for a rich crop of corn, he had, standing on his ground, atheistically replied, "Thank God, nay, rather thank my dung cart." The speech of a dunghill spirit, more filthy than the muck in his cart. But if thou wilt be a Christian, thou must acknowledge God in all thy ways, not leaning to thy own understanding. And this will direct thee to him when success crowns thy labors, to crown God with the praise. Jacob labored as diligently and took as much pains for the estate he had at last as another, yet laying the foundation of all in prayer and expecting the blessing from heaven. Genesis 28:20. He ascribes all that fair estate he at last was possessed of to the mercy and truth of God, whom he had in his poor state, when with his pilgrim staff he was traveling to Padanaram, engaged by a solemn vow to provide for him. Genesis chapter 32, verse 10. Fourthly, when the Christian is content with the portion, little or much, that God upon his endeavors allots him, not content because he cannot have it otherwise. Necessity was the heathen's schoolmaster to teach contentment, but faith must be the Christian's, whereby he acquiesces in the dispositions of God's providence with a sweet complacency, as in the will of God concerning him. Here is godliness in triumph, when the Christian can carve contentment out of God's providence, whatever the dish is that is set before him. If he gathers little, he lacks not, but is satisfied with his short meal. If he gather much, he hath nothing over. I mean not more than his grace can well digest and turn to good nourishment. Nothing over that turns to bad humors of pride and wantonness. This was the pitch Paul obtained to. Philippians chapter 4, verse 14. He knew how to abound and how to want. Take contentment from godliness, and you take one of the best jewels away she wears in her bosom. Godliness with contentment is great gain. Not godliness with an estate, but godliness with contentment. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 16. Fifthly, when the Christian's particular calling doth not encroach upon his general. Truly, this requires a strong guard. The world is of an encroaching nature. Hard it is to converse with it and not come into bondage to it, as Hagar, when Abraham showed her some respect more than ordinary, began to contest with, yea, crow over her mistress, so will our worldly employments justle with our heavenly, if we keep not a strict hand over them. Now the power of holiness appears here in two things. First, when the Christian suffers not his worldly business to eat up his time for communion with God, but keeps it inviolable from the sacrilegious hands of the world. The Christian may observe that if he will listen to it, he shall never think of setting up about any religious duty, but some excuse or other to pull it off will present itself to his thoughts. This thing must be just now done, that friend spoken with or customer waited for, so that, as the wise man saith, he that observeth the wind shall not sow, and he that regardeth the clouds shall not reap. Ecclesiastes 6:4. So he that will regard with his own sloth, worldly interests, and fleshly parts suggest, he shall never pray, meditate, or hold communion with God in any other religious duty. Oh, it is sad when the master must ask the man leave when to eat and when not, when the Christian must take his orders from the world, when to wait on God and when not, whereas religion should give law to that. Then holiness is in its power, as Samson in his strength, when it can snap asunder these excuses that would keep him from his God as easily as he did his cords of flax. When the Christian can make his way into the presence of God through the throne of worldly encumbrances. Behold, saith David, I have in my trouble prepared for the house of the Lord 100,000 talents of gold and 1,000 talents of silver, etc. 1 Chronicles 22, verse 14. He had ways enough to dispose of his treasures if he would have been discouraged from the work. He might have had a fair apology from the wars he was all his reign involved in, which were continually draining his exchequer. Exchequer, to have spared this cost. But as Rome showed her persistence in sending succors to Spain when Hannibal was at her gates, so David will show his zeal for God in his house by laying aside such vast sums for the building of a temple in the midst of troubles and expenses of his kingdom. He is the Christian indeed that lays aside a good portion of time daily in the midst of all his worldly occasions to communion with God. Whosoever he compounds with and pays short, he dares not make bold with God to serve him by halves. He shall have his time devoted to him, though others are put off with the less. Like that devout man who, when his time for his devotions came, what company soever he was with, would take his leave of them with this fair excuse: he had a friend that stayed to speak with him. He meant his God. Secondly, when his worldly employments do not turn the edge of his affections and leave a bluntness upon the spirit as to holding communion with God. Here is holiness in the power, as the husband when he hath been abroad all day, in this company and that. Yet none of these makes him love his wife and children the less. When he comes home at night, he brings his affections to them as entire as when he went out. Yea, he is glad he has got from all others to them again. This is a sweet frame of spirit indeed. But alas, how hard to keep it. Canst thou say, O Christian, after thou hast passed a day amidst thy worldly profits, and been entertained with the delight and pleasures which thy full estate affords thee, that thou bringest thy whole heart to thy God with thee, when at night thou returnest into his presence to wait on him? Thou canst say more than many can that have some good in them. Oh, it is hard to converse with the world all day and shake it off at night, so as to be free to enjoy privacy with God. The world does by the Christian as the little child by the mother. If it cannot keep the mother from going out, then it will cry after her to go with her. If the world cannot keep us from going to religious duties, then it will cry to be taken along with us, and much ado to part it and the affections. Fourthly, the Christian must express the power of holiness in his carriage and behavior to others, and they are either within doors or without. End of chapter 8, having been read by Peter John Percy.